All right, we are going to continue this morning looking at miracles. So this will be our last Sunday morning talking about miracles, and then next week Tim is going to take over. So what I want to do this morning is simply just refresh ourselves with our definition of what a miracle is, and then I want us to try to look just at three miracles. Hopefully we'll have time to cover these three, and these will hopefully give us just a sample of the miracles that Jesus performed, some of the different areas in which he performed these miracles. And what I want us to do when we look at these miracles is simply read the miracles, read the text, notice some observations that might be relevant from the text in terms of the original environment and what might have been going on at the time, and then see if there aren't some practical things that you and I can take from these miracles that might strengthen us as we think about how we live here on this earth and how we have a responsibility in our response to Jesus as well. So let's start by going back and looking at our definition. This is the definition that we've anchored to, recognizing that there are probably several different definitions that a person could come up with in terms of how to define a miracle. But this is the one that I chose. I like it. I think it's a pretty good definition overall. An event in the physical world enabled by immediate power of God and intended as a sign or manifestation. And again, what's some of the purposes that we talked about in terms of miracles? What were their purposes? Confirm the word or confirm the message. Absolutely. What else? Confirm the messenger. Yep. What's that? To glorify God. Yep. What else? Especially miracles that were performed by Jesus, miracles that we see from the apostles in the book of Acts and in other places. What would have been a purpose of those miracles? In the power of God? Confirm that Christ is the Son of God? Yep. What else? One other thing I'm looking for specific. Healing? All right. Yep. And what did that lead? What was that intended, hopefully, to lead to within an individual? Faith. Yep. Help establish faith. Strengthen faith. All right. So those are just some things that we've already talked about, some background information. Now, let's start by looking at a miracle that has to do with healing of the sick. We're going to look at the woman from Capernaum. Let's open our Bibles together. Let's start. I'll tell you what. Somebody go to Matthew chapter 9. And if you would, read verses 20 through 20, well, let me see if I want to go a little bit beyond that. Read verses 18 through 22 for me, from Matthew chapter 9, if somebody would read those. So just from Matthew's account, what are some things that we know about this particular situation? Yeah, any of those things, right? About the woman, about the circumstances surrounding this particular event.
One of the things we know is that it was not focused. Jesus was traveling elsewhere.
Okay.
This was not his purpose.
Yeah, so this ends up being a miracle within him going to perform another miracle, right? So the original intent of this particular situation occurred in the context of something else he was on his way to do. All right? Very good. What else?
To show her faith. She didn't approach Jesus and ask him to do something. She just knew that if she just touches his clothes.
So her faith becomes a key part of this miracle, doesn't it? All right? I think I heard somebody else about to say something. Okay. Connie said the same thing. She thought it first. She thought it first. She said she thought it first, though. What else? What are some other things we might know from this? So here's what's interesting. Some miracles occur only in one gospel. Others occur in multiple gospels. This is one that occurs in both Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It occurs in 3 of the gospel accounts. Matthew's account is actually the shortest and gives us the least amount of detail overall. So turn with me now to Mark chapter 9. Or chapter 5, actually. Mark chapter 5. Let's read together Mark's account, because Mark's going to provide some additional detail that helps, again, just to provide a richer and more full picture of the miracle and what occurs. When Jesus, at the beginning of verse 21, when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and so he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and on seeing him fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live." And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. A woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, "If I just touch his garment, I will get well." Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." So we get a lot more detail in Mark's account, don't we? Helps to paint a picture in our minds of what the scene must have looked like. Describe for me what Mark paints for us here in terms of the situation Jesus finds himself in. What does Mark say is happening to Jesus as this situation unfolds?
He's in a crowd.
How much of Jesus' ministry occurs in that type of setting? I can't help but wonder sometimes, and it does, the text here doesn't say that Jesus was looking for rest, and I'm not even sure that he was, but I can't help but think in my mind, how many times Jesus probably was just trying to find peace for just a few moments. And inevitably, instead of finding peace, what he finds himself in is a situation where people are just pressing in from all sides around him. There's a whole lesson that we could spend in a Bible class just upon that. Jesus interrupted, if you will. Think about how many times Jesus set out to do something, was interrupted. And what was his response in almost every situation? Boy, Dave used the word compassion. If you and I were to sit down and start making a list of characteristics of Jesus and his ministry and how he interacted with people, compassion would have to be certainly somewhere at the top of that list. It was a word that was defining of Jesus and his ministry. Now, today's point, what happens to this woman from Capernaum was not the original part of what started this particular event. It was Jairus. Mark provides some additional detail around who this particular individual was that comes to Jesus about his daughter. And I can't help, obviously being a dad of 4 daughters, but certainly any of us that have been around children, whether we have them or not, can almost just picture in our minds Jairus and his voice and pleading with Christ as he approaches him. So Jesus, as he listens to Jairus, the compassion that Jesus has, he sets out to go with him. Now, what do we know about this woman? Mark provides some additional detail about the woman from Capernaum. What do we know about her? Tremendous amount of suffering. So Mark adds some detail. How long has she been dealing with this particular issue, the hemorrhaging? 12 years. Is this the first time she sought treatment? Absolutely not. It says she's exhausted what? Everything that she had, all of her belongings. Now, I want you to think with me about a couple of things. Think about the fact that she suffered with this for 12 years. And think about miracles. The fact that they are events that occur quickly. There's no denying the power of them. There's no ability to argue whether or not they were done by God. Suffering for 12 years. This was something that people more than likely from her community knew about. Now, let's think about this fact too. This would have made her as a Jew ceremonially unclean. Keep your marker here in Mark chapter 5 and let's go back to Leviticus. Let's look at a couple verses from Leviticus. Let's go to chapter 15. Leviticus chapter 15. Now, Leviticus is one of those books that when you read it, if you just set it down by itself and read it as part of a daily Bible reading, there's mornings where you're just like, I got to push through this, and you sit it down and you're like, okay, you know what is that? What is that? How does that all tie in? And it's easy sometimes not to reflect back on how these laws impacted the people and what their purpose was. There are several purposes when we go back in some of these laws in the book of Leviticus. We know today the importance of coming in contact with blood and what can happen as a result of that, different things that can happen medically as a result of that. So God, in His infinite wisdom, again pointing to the inspiration of Scriptures, knew that long before the medical community ever thought anything about it. But in addition to that, the laws impacted the people. And this is one of those when we think about this woman. She would have been ceremonially unclean. Leviticus chapter 15, let's start in verse 19. When a woman has a discharge, her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue in her menstrual impurity for 7 days. And whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Everything also on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean, and everything on which she sits shall be unclean. Anyone who touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. Whether it be on the bed or on the thing on which she is sitting, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until evening. If a man actually lies with her so that her menstrual impurity is on him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. Now, there's two possibilities here, at least in my mind. There may be more. If this situation would have impacted this woman when she was a young teen, it's more than likely she would have never been married because she would have been unclean and no man would have wanted to marry her. If this would have started after she was married, well, there's implications there as well. Turn over just a few pages now to Leviticus chapter 18. Look at verse 19. Also, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness during her menstrual impurity. You see, if she was married, and this started after she was married, then her husband was not allowed to approach her in any capacity from a sexual standpoint while she was suffering from this situation. So, it's quite possible that this woman had no children. So she was either unmarried, or if she was married, and if indeed she didn't have any children, then that would have been a very bad situation for her in terms of her marriage. It would have been a situation where more than likely her husband would have put her away at some point in time. Not saying that was the right thing to do, I'm saying that's just what was the custom in that particular situation. But now, let's think about this from the standpoint of ceremonially unclean. What would have been the impact of that for this particular woman? What are some things that she would have been forbidden to do if she was ceremonially unclean? She couldn't go to the temple. She couldn't worship, could she? What else? She would have certainly been isolated socially. Yeah, no question about it. To what extent, I'm not 100% sure, but there's no doubt she would have had some level of isolation in terms of her ability to go out in the public, and certainly no one would have wanted to touch her. What's that? Much like a leper, absolutely. Same basic principle in terms of being ceremonially unclean, absolutely. Now, think about that for just a moment. This woman, more than likely, very rarely, if at all, ever experienced human touch. That's a profound thing. And we see that several times throughout Jesus' ministry, him interacting with people that more than likely had very little, if any, human touch at all. So these are all things that are impacting this woman. This is just some background that helps set this in our minds, give us a mental picture of what might have been going on for this particular woman. So now, what are some things this woman had to overcome then in order to even approach Jesus for this to happen? All right, so we already said what? That Jesus found himself where? I mean, what does Mark say? He's being pressed on from every side, right? So this woman already was ostracized by society more than likely. So just mentally, her desire to go out into that crowd would have been difficult, I think. But beyond that, just the sheer logistics of navigating through this crowd to get close enough to Jesus. That couldn't have been easy, Margaret. Okay. Or she would have touched them, right? So Margaret brings up a good point about the fact that whoever she would have touched or somebody would have touched her would have been unclean as well. And I want to hold that thought for a very particular purpose here in just a moment. What else? So we talked about the crowd. I think we've implied the public humiliation piece. What would be possibly one more thing that was a reality for her that she would have had to overcome? Was there any guarantee that she would be healed? She couldn't have known for sure. Her faith, she believed it. But there was a possibility, at least to some degree, that maybe she wouldn't be healed. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So Connie brings up a point, and I like what you said at the end. You can almost sense the desperation in this woman, right? She's exhausted everything she had. I mean, it's almost like this is her last hope. So she's willing to overcome all these obstacles to just touch the hem of his garment. All right, so there's some things that she overcame. Oh, getting ahead of myself. Now, what happens then in terms of Jesus' response? What are some things that you find interesting about Jesus' response here as he interacts with this woman? So interesting. So Luke would actually tell us, so one of the disciples, Mark says one of the disciples says, how on earth could you have known who touched you? You've got all these people pressing around you. What are you talking about? Luke would tell us that that was who? Who does that sound like? Of all the disciples, who does that sound like that would say something like that? Peter. That's right. Peter. I probably would have said something like that too. Yeah, Jesus knew that healing power had gone out of him. So the reason Jesus knew that she had touched him wasn't from the necessarily the physical touch of the pulling on the garment. It's what had occurred in terms of the power that went out from him that provided the healing from her. All right? So what else? What are some other things that you find interesting in terms of Jesus' response and what he did? Well, even before we get there, is she healed? How long did it take? A week? A month? It's instantaneous, right? Any doubt in her mind? Nope, not any doubt. Now, let's go back to something Margaret said. According to the law that we read in Leviticus, what was supposed to happen if an individual touched someone who was unclean? Was Jesus unclean? Okay. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that there's an element that the fact that she touched him, whether it was his garment, that was an extension of him, it still would have had implication for him.
It's like in the Testament, whatever they sat,
Yeah.
whatever bed they were laid on, that was unclean. You couldn't touch it. He said it's close. Whatever you could touch it before.
So let's remember, Jesus, 100% man. He felt the crowd pressing him around him. He felt the pressures of his ministry on a day-to-day basis. He had compassion on people, just like you and I would experience all those things. But in addition to being 100% man, he was also what? 100% God. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. I believe at some point we've talked about this idea that light is the only thing that can purify without becoming contaminated itself. And I think I've used the illustration even before. You know, you think about a laundry detergent. You can take soiled clothes, you can put them in the washing machine, and that laundry detergent is a purifying agent. But once you pour it in that washing machine and wash those clothes, they'll come out clean, but can you use that detergent again? No, it's contaminated, right? It's dirty. But you take light, you take one of these light bulbs, if we were to black out this room entirely where no light could get in here at all, and we put one light bulb in one of those sockets and turn it on, what does it do? It illuminates, doesn't it? It eliminates the darkness. But yet, when you turn that light off, is there any darkness in the light bulb? No, you can take that light bulb, you can go to another room that's exactly the same way and do that thing over and over again. It doesn't become contaminated itself. And I think it's an important aspect of this particular miracle to recognize, again, the deity of Christ. The fact that he is God. And so therefore, when this woman touched him, at least in part, there's this idea that when Jesus touches something that is unclean or soiled, he makes it completely clean. And he himself does not become contaminated. Now, what's the implication for you and me in terms of that? Boy, there's a significant spiritual lesson there for us, isn't it? Are we contaminated when we come to Christ? Absolutely. We're every bit as ceremonially unclean as this woman would have been in terms of our spiritual condition. When you and I are first approaching Christ and we submit to him in baptism, when we come to him, up to that point before we are immersed in water, we are in that same situation. But you see, we come in contact with his blood, and then spiritually we receive the same healing that this woman received physically. In that water, the blood of Jesus, it is not contaminated because of us and our uncleanness. It completely purifies us. We come up out of that water a new creature. So an important aspect of the miracle at least to think about. Now, what's something else, though, that Jesus asks of her or says of her in terms of what helped make her well? Yeah. It's interesting that Jesus kept pressing. Could Jesus have just kept walking? Yeah, absolutely, right? Would the woman have still been healed? Yes. I think it's at least interesting to consider, why did he stop and press the situation so much? Why did he press to find out who did it and press it to the point that she was compelled to come and confess that? And I think it's possible that a key aspect of that is acknowledging her faith publicly. Acknowledging how important her faith was, and it was the fact that she had that faith that made her well. There was almost this sense of having her come to confess this as part of that confession of belief in Christ and his power and his ability to heal. And the importance of that occurring publicly. Again, seems to be a lot of similarity, doesn't there, to us and what we do in terms of when we come to Christ. All right, what else? Anything else that you find interesting or compelling about this particular miracle that we may not have touched on?
He tells her to go in peace, which is contrast to the last 12 years she's had.
Oh boy, that's a great point. Think about what the next 12 years would have been like compared to those 12 years. Yeah. And the idea of, that idea of peace for me, I always think about that in the sense of, don't hang on to what the last 12 years was like. Let go. Let it heal. John?
I was going to add to your last comment. The word there is go, your faith has saved you.
Yeah.
That's literally what the word is. It's so
Yeah.
It's the same word.
Yep.
And it's exactly what the ruler of the synagogue praised Jesus to do.
Yep.
Come, save my daughter.
Yep.
And here he's talking about physical death. Like Dave mentioned, the peace is both physical and spiritual.
Yep.
The salvation is both physical and spiritual. And there's
So John brings up a good point. That word peace in other situations is actually translated, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, saved. And it's the same, correct?
that you may be well.
Okay, that you may be well.
Is saved.
Okay, right. So that word. So that's a great comparison there in terms of, it's not just the idea of well, but there's the implication of saved from that disease, and obviously that implication for us as well. Margaret?
Well, then she came, after it says when she joined, came here and really around, but I think even though she had faith in what had happened, there was fear of, she didn't know that he would be upset when she.
Sure.
And, when she was unclean, so that I think that told people in a lot of terms, like, don't worry about it, you're okay. Because, and then we were reading Leviticus, 25 and below, talks about a woman's discharge that is not from her menstrual time. And even when it says that she is healed of the discharge, she still had 7 days, she had to wait before she was clean. So even if she knew she'd been felt it and knew she'd been cured of it, Jewish tradition, she still would never feel like clean for 7 days after she was healed.
Yep. Yep. Good point.
The fact too that, Jesus stopped, he knew who touched him.
Sure.
He's 100% God. He knew who touched him. So he stops, takes the time. She's physically healed, but she's socially clean at the same time. Everybody has to stop. Jesus stopped. They all looked at her. And the exchange between them basically allows her to be healed, but also the social aspect of it.
Okay. Dave?
To John's point, where it says, your faith has literally sozo to save you, so literally means. That's very direct contrast to what he adds, and be healed of your affliction. So there's 2 different aspects.
Yep.
Her faith has saved her, and she's healed of her affliction.
Yep. Dawn, I see your hand.
Yes, this is the condition that I feel like she had was, it's actually very common, but in our country, women can go to the doctor and have this taken care of, but in third world countries, it's still a problem for
Yep.
women, and women are actually forced to live outside their villages, and if they have children, they can't see them, they can't be around their families. So it is still something that in other places people have to deal with.
Yeah, that's a great point. And think about, so the social implications, but even in the context here, being a woman, I mean, she had multiple strikes against her. One of the things that I believe is so fascinating about Jesus' ministry is he did more to elevate women in terms of his ministry and in terms of Christianity than people a lot of times want to give him credit for. But it's absolutely an issue that still impacts folks today. Vern, did I see your hand?
Yes, sir. The thought that I see here is that the woman was questioning her faith, but she still continued to act. And in Jesus addressing her faith as that which is, for the doctor healing her, it is indicating that it is not the faith in the sense of a mental aspect. It is an
Sure.
Not believe it, like the fact that he recognized her and told her she was used in front of the crowd, let them know also the miraculous was going to happen. They
Yep.
don't necessarily believe it.
Yep. Good point. All right.
That is an important point.
Yep.
Because a lot of people think that it's just your faith that heals you, makes you well, tells us. But this is in contrast to what the martyr made with regard to the fact that was in contrast to Acts 3 when Peter reaches out to the lame man and he is healed, who had no knowledge or understanding of faith. And so there are many in the world today that think that's all that's necessary. To Bert's point, the fact that it was her acting upon her belief, which is what healed her, versus just her having it.
So several points have been made that all tie back to the idea of faith and the fact that she acted upon that. There was something that she did on her part, and Jesus' recognition of that so that all around knew what had occurred as well. Good points. All right, let's see if we can't get one more in here. Let's look at the demoniac in Gadara. So let's go to Mark chapter 5. That's where I want to go. I can at least read it. All right, I tell you what, let's do this. Let's read it. And as I read it, let's see if we can't do this. If you would think in your mind, what are 2 or 3 possible lessons that you and I can learn from this particular miracle that we might be able to take in our lives and benefit from, okay? So let's look at Mark chapter 5, and we'll read verses 1 through 20. And you think about those things in your mind. They came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him any more, even with a chain. Because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, the Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him, but he said to him, "Go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim to Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. All right. So in the last 3 minutes, what are some things that you believe that we could probably take from this, lessons that we might learn, just from this particular miracle? No matter how bad your situation is, Jesus can heal you. How about looking at it this way? Jesus loved the unlovable, didn't he? You think about how many examples in Scripture, the unclean woman, this particular demon-possessed man, how many outcasts of society that Jesus would interact with. What's the lesson for you and me there? We all deserve love. What's our tendency sometimes? Just maybe to some degree human nature. Stick to our own, don't we? Yeah, we like our comfort zones, don't we? Like to stick to those things that make us comfortable, John?
I was going to say, perfect love casts out fear.
Perfect love casts out fear. Yeah. There's a few ways we could probably go with that one. Jesus focused, though, on the people that many times were in the most desperate of situations. He showed them again human touch, compassion, love, concern, empathy. What an incredible reminder and example for you and for me. What about this? How we respond to Jesus matters. Two responses we see to Jesus at the end of this particular miracle. What were those two responses? Go away. Yeah. Can you imagine? Think about this for just a moment. And I guess in fairness, it's easy to criticize when you're on this side of it looking and fail to recognize just how incredibly powerful this miracle must have been. There was no denying what this man experienced. Everybody knew it. I mean, he had been bound with shackles. He had found himself in different situations. Everybody around knew exactly the situation this particular man was in. But yet, Jesus healed him. And I would have to believe it's an element of fear. Instead of recognizing him as Jesus and wanting to embrace that, it scared them to the point they wanted to slip away. Now, contrast that to the demon-possessed man. What did he want to do? He wanted to go with him. Jesus told him what? No, you go back home. You tell him of all that I've done. And proclaim his name. A lesson there for us in terms of, hey, we need to be together for strength, but we also need to make sure that we're going out telling people about the great things that Jesus has done. All right, thanks for bearing with me. I know we did that last one a little quick. We are dismissed till 10 o'clock.